Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome back to another adventure tonight. I invite you to settle in, to close your eyes, and to drift into a world of magic and wonder. The story you are about to hear is a cherished tale from the Brothers Grimm, a gentle and heartwarming fable of kindness, gratitude, and unseen magic. It is the tale of the Whispering Elves, a story of a humble shoemaker whose fortunes change in the quiet stillness of night, thanks to the mysterious hands of those who work in secret. This story will take you to a place of warmth and wonder, where kindness and magic weave together in the stillness of a winter's night. Close your eyes and let the story begin. The Whispering Elves. Chapter 1. Beneath the soft glow of a waning moon, a gentle hush settled over the sleepy village. The cobblestone streets, kissed by the silver light of the night sky, wove through the heart of the town, past cottages with thatched roofs and chimneys, curling wisps of fragrant smoke into the cold air. Lanterns flickered in the windows, their golden glow like warm embers against the midnight blue of the heavens. At the very edge of the village, where the old road curved towards the whispering forest, stood a modest shoemaker's shop. The building was small, its timbered walls weathered by years of patient toil. A wooden sign, worn but sturdy, creaked softly in the evening breeze. Everett's Shoes, cobbler of fine craftsmanship. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of leather and beeswax, the familiar perfume of dedication and artistry. A single candle flickered on the workbench, its wax pooling at the base as it cast long shadows along the wooden walls. At this hour, most of the village was tucked away in slumber, but within the humble shop, the shoemaker remained at his bench, hands worn with labor, fingers calloused from years of stitching and shaping fine footwear. Everett, an aging man with kind eyes and a patient heart, sat hunched over his last remaining scraps of leather. His wife, Agnes, stood nearby, her hands folded before her apron, watching her husband with quiet concern. They had known hardship before, but never had the weight of it pressed so heavily upon them. "We have so little left," she murmured, glancing at the worn countertop where their supplies lay. "Enough for but one pair." Everett nodded, his fingers tracing the grain of the leather, as though seeking answers from its familiar touch. "One pair," he echoed, his voice gentle, yet tinged with the weariness of a man who had given all he had to his craft. His mind wandered to the past, to the early days when his hands were strong and the shop had thrived. The people of the village had once come to him eagerly, trusting him to fashion shoes that would carry them through life's journey. Travelers would stop by, their weary feet finding solace in his work, and nobles from neighboring towns would commission fine boots of supple hide. Those were days of prosperity and ease, when gold jingled in his coin purse, and Agnes hummed as she baked warm loaves of bread by the hearth. But times had changed. New merchants arrived in the village, selling cheaper shoes made hastily in large factories. People sought quick bargains, their pockets too lean to afford true craftsmanship. One by one, his customers had dwindled, their needs shifting toward expediency rather than quality. Now all that remained of his once flourishing shop were these final scraps of leather, the last vestiges of his trade. Everett sighed and picked up his tools, running his fingers over the fine stitching of his previous work. He had always prided himself on precision, on the way each shoe was shaped with patience and care. Even now, with only enough material for one last pair, he would not compromise his craft. If this was to be his final work, it would be made with the same love and devotion as every pair before it. With quiet determination, He reached for the worn shears and began to cut. The blade whispered through the leather, a sound so familiar, so soothing, that for a moment he forgot his troubles. He worked slowly, carefully, ensuring each piece was shaped to perfection. As he stitched, the rhythmic motion of his hands steadied his heart, bringing him a small sense of peace. Agnes moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It will be enough," she whispered, though her voice carried uncertainty. Everett smiled at her, weary but warm. "It must be." They sat together in the dim candlelight, sharing a silence filled with unspoken thoughts. At last, with the final piece laid out before him, Everett set down his tools and wiped his hands against his apron. "We shall finish it in the morning," he said, stretching his stiff fingers. Agnes nodded, taking his hand in hers. "Come to bed," she urged gently. "Rest, love." He hesitated, glancing once more at the unfinished work before him. But the hour was late, and his body, weary from years of labor, begged for reprieve. With a final glance at his workbench, Everett rose from his stool and let Agnes guide him to their small adjoining quarters. As they climbed beneath the heavy woolen blankets, the wind outside rustled the trees, whispering secrets through the branches. The candle in the shop guttered, its final flickers casting fleeting shadows against the walls before succumbing to darkness. And in the quiet hush of the workshop, where the scent of leather and wax lingered, something unseen stirred. The night held its breath, waiting. Everett and Agnes drifted into sleep, unaware that beneath the silver moonlight spilling through the workshop window, magic was about to unfold. Chapter 2. The first light of dawn crept through the frost-laced window panes, casting golden ribbons across the wooden floor. Outside, the village still slumbered, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant bark of a dog greeting the morning. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys as the scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the baker's cottage, winding its way down the narrow streets. Everett stirred, rolling onto his side, as the warmth of the blankets threatened to lull him back into sleep. But something gnawed at the edge of his consciousness, a half-formed thought that urged him awake. The shoes. The last of the leather. His unfinished work. With a quiet groan, he pushed himself upright and swung his feet to the floor, his worn slippers barely muffling the creak of the old wooden planks. Agnes murmured softly in her sleep as he pulled his robe tighter around his shoulders and padded toward the workshop. He expected to see the neatly arranged pieces of leather, waiting for his hands to shape them into their final form. But the sight that met his eyes instead made him halt mid-step, his breath catching in his throat. Upon his workbench sat a finished pair of shoes. Not merely completed, but exquisite beyond anything he had ever crafted. The stitches were impossibly fine, each thread woven so precisely it seemed the work of some unseen master artisan. The leather gleamed as if polished by moonlight itself, supple yet strong, the kind of craftsmanship that only the most skilled hands could produce. Everett reached out with trembling fingers, running them along the perfectly formed edges, the seamless soles. His mind whirled. He had left the shoes unfinished. No one else had been in the workshop. And yet, here they were. "Agnes," he murmured, scarcely finding his voice. A soft rustling came from behind him. "Everett?" Agnes's voice was thick with sleep as she appeared in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "What is it?" Everett turned slowly, holding the shoes aloft as though they might disappear should he blink. "They're finished," he said in a whisper. Agnes frowned, stepping closer. When her eyes fell upon the shoes, she let out a quiet gasp. "But you left them half done." "I know." Everett exhaled slowly, placing the shoes back onto the workbench. "I didn't finish them. Someone else did." A long silence stretched between them. Agnes reached out, running a tentative finger over the smooth leather. "But who?" she whispered. Everett shook his head. "I don't know." Outside, the first sounds of the waking village began to rise, footsteps crunching on frost-covered paths, the distant chatter of merchants setting up their wares. But inside the shoemaker's shop, the air held a strange stillness, as though something unseen lingered, watching, waiting. And for the first time in a long while, hope flickered in Everett's heart. Chapter 3. The candlelight flickered against the wooden walls of the shoemaker's shop, casting long, wavering shadows as the night deepened. The village beyond lay still, wrapped in the hush of midnight, save for the occasional gust of wind whispering through the bare branches. The workshop, usually a space of quiet labor, now held an air of mystery, of secrets just beyond the reach of understanding. Everett and Agnes sat in the dim glow, their breath barely audible, their hearts thudding with anticipation. Tonight they had resolved to uncover the truth, to discover the hands behind the miraculous work that had saved their shop from ruin. The shoemaker had spent the day pretending all was as it had always been, his fingers moving through the habitual motions of cutting and stitching. But now, as the village slept, he and his wife had taken their places behind a thick curtain, barely daring to breathe as they watched the empty workbench. Time stretched, measured only by the soft crackling of the dying fire. The night deepened, the stillness grew heavy, and then a faint sound, soft like the rustle of fabric, then another. A whispering sigh, almost like laughter, but impossibly delicate, like the brushing of wind through leaves. Everett felt Agnes's fingers tighten around his arm. He dared not move, scarcely even blinked, as the shadows in the workshop seemed to stir, to shift. And then, as if the very air itself had come alive, tiny figures emerged from the darkness. Elves. They were no taller than a child's hand, their forms slender and light, their movements as fluid as the drifting mist of dawn. They wore garments fashioned from the petals of flowers, stitched with shimmering thread finer than spider's silk. Their feet were bare, their ears long and pointed, their eyes glimmering with mischief and wisdom beyond reckoning. They moved with silent purpose, their hands working with impossible speed and precision. Everett and Agnes watched, entranced, as the elves set about their mysterious task. Tiny fingers lifted the waiting leather, shaping it, sewing it with stitches too fine for human hands to replicate. Their laughter was like the chime of distant bells, soft and fleeting. They whispered to one another in a language unknown to human ears, their voices blending with the quiet hum of the night. Everett's throat tightened. He had spent a lifetime perfecting his craft, but what these beings could do, what they created, was beyond mortal skill. They did not work from patterns or measures. They worked as though they simply knew, as though the shoes had always existed, and they were merely bringing them forth into the world. The smallest of the elves, a delicate creature with hair like spun silver, reached out and touched the unfinished leather pieces. A shimmer of something unseen, perhaps magic, perhaps something more ancient, seemed to ripple through the air. The others followed suit, their hands moving in perfect harmony, shaping the material into a masterpiece before Everett's disbelieving eyes. Minutes passed like seconds. The elves moved swiftly, effortlessly, each stitch a mark of pure artistry. When at last the final thread was tied, They stood back, admiring their work with wide, gleaming eyes. One elf, smaller than the rest, traced a hand over the finished pair of shoes, murmuring something too soft to hear. The others nodded, their delicate fingers brushing the leather, as though blessing it with some quiet magic before they stepped back into the shadows. One of the elves turned, pausing for a moment as if sensing something unseen. Everett held his breath. Did they know he was watching? The elf tilted its head, listening. Then, without a sound, it twirled away, vanishing into the dim light. Everett and Agnes watched as the tiny figures, as suddenly as they had appeared, melted into the dimness, vanishing into the cracks of the night. Only the whisper of their laughter remained, curling in the air like the last notes of a song. A faint shimmer lingered in the air, the echoes of something ancient and benevolent. For a long while, neither Everett nor Agnes spoke. They sat in breathless silence, staring at the exquisite shoes gleaming beneath the candlelight. The workbench, once a place of toil, now felt sacred, an altar upon which something extraordinary had occurred. At last, Everett turned to his wife, his voice hushed, reverent. "Did you see?" Agnes nodded, her eyes still wide with wonder. "They were real." Everett exhaled slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for the shoes. He lifted them gently, as if afraid they might vanish like a dream. "They helped us," he murmured. "They saved us." Agnes touched his hand, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "Then we must find a way to thank them." Her words settled between them, an unspoken promise. The elves had given them a gift beyond measure, and though they had disappeared into the night, Everett and Agnes knew they must show gratitude in return. Beyond the walls of the little shop, the wind whispered once more, rustling the trees in the quiet night. The elves were gone, but their magic lingered, woven into every thread, every stitch. And for the first time in many years, Everett and Agnes felt something bloom in their hearts. Hope. Chapter 4. The morning sun crept through the frost-laced window panes of the shoemaker's shop, casting long golden beams across the wooden floor. The light danced upon the finished pair of shoes, illuminating every flawless stitch, every polished curve. Everett sat before them, hands resting lightly on the workbench, still reeling from the wonder of the night before. "They were real," Agnes murmured, standing beside him, her fingers brushing the back of his shoulder. Everett nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the shoes. "More than real. They are miraculous." A silence passed between them, but it was not one of uncertainty. It was a silence filled with reverence, with gratitude, with something deeper than words could express. The elves had come in the dead of night, had worked their magic, and had vanished into the shadows without a trace, without seeking praise or reward. "But we must reward them," Agnes said, as if reading his thoughts. She turned to her husband, her brown eyes warm with resolve. "They have saved us, Everett. We cannot let such kindness go unthanked." Everett exhaled, rubbing his chin. "But what do elves desire? They took nothing from us. They work only in secret, as though asking for no recognition." Agnes glanced toward the window, where the winter sky stretched pale and bright. A thought began to form, taking shape like a stitch upon fine leather. "Did you see what they wore?" she asked. Everett furrowed his brows, recalling the delicate figures that had moved so swiftly through the workshop. Then he saw them again in his mind's eye, their tiny hands sewing with unearthly speed, their laughter soft as the wind. And he remembered their clothes, thin, tattered garments, woven from scraps of petals and leaves, their small, bare feet light upon the wooden floor. They were dressed in rags, Agnes whispered. "Everett, they give us the finest shoes in the world, and yet they have nothing of their own." Everett's expression softened, realization dawning. Then we shall give them what they do not have. And so a new task began in the shoemaker's shop. For the first time in many days, Everett and Agnes worked not for survival, but for joy. Everett selected the finest remnants of fabric they had left, soft velvet, fine wool, and even a scrap of silk saved from a noble's commission long ago. He cut and shaped each piece with the same precision he gave to his shoes, carefully fashioning tiny shirts, coats and breeches. Agnes sewed with delicate stitches, her fingers moving with the same patience and love as when she had once mended Everett's own worn clothes in their younger days. Together they crafted tiny cloaks lined with wool, mittens no larger than a walnut, and even small caps to keep the elves' pointed ears warm. Each piece was made with care, with gratitude, with an unspoken hope that the elves would accept this humble offering. By nightfall the garments were ready. The shoemaker and his wife laid them carefully upon the workbench, folding each item neatly beside a waiting pair of unfinished shoes. Then, as before, they dimmed the candlelight and retreated behind the curtain, their hearts fluttering in anticipation. The hours stretched on. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, sending shadows waltzing across the walls. Outside, the winter wind murmured through the trees. Everett and Agnes remained still, listening for the telltale signs of the night's quiet visitors. And then it happened again. A whisper of movement, a rustle of air, a faint, chiming giggle like wind dancing through hollow reeds. One by one the elves emerged, their slender figures slipping from the darkness, their bright eyes gleaming in the candlelight. As before, they moved with purpose, setting upon their work, their tiny hands flying over the leather with inhuman skill. But then one of them paused. The smallest elf, the one with hair like spun silver, turned toward the pile of clothing. He tilted his head, his luminous eyes reflecting the fire's glow. He reached out, hesitantly at first, and touched the fabric. A gasp-like whisper rippled through the group as the other elves noticed. They abandoned their work, their nimble fingers brushing over the tiny garments, marveling at the softness of the wool, the silkiness of the lining. Their delicate fingers traced the embroidery, as if feeling the kindness stitched into every thread. Then slowly, with childlike delight, they dressed. One by one they pulled on the shirts and coats, wrapped the warm scarves around their slender necks. Their laughter, pure, bright, full of joy, filled the workshop like the ringing of tiny bells. They twirled and danced in their new clothes, spinning in giddy circles, their feet tapping against the wooden floor in a sound like raindrops against a roof. Some of the elves tugged at the mittens in playful delight, while others admired their reflections in the polished leather of the shoes they had crafted. Everett and Agnes, hidden behind the curtain, watched in awe, their hearts swelling. Never had they seen such happiness, such unrestrained delight, such innocent gratitude. The elves, who had asked for nothing, had received something given from the heart, and it had filled them with joy beyond measure. Finally, as the merriment softened, the elves turned back to the shoes. Dressed in their warm new garments, they resumed their work, moving swiftly, effortlessly, as if their fingers carried new energy, new warmth. They stitched with precision, their hands light and quick, their movements imbued with quiet gratitude. Everett could swear he saw a faint, shimmering glow surrounding them as they worked, a kind of magic made stronger by the warmth of a grateful heart. And then, when the last thread was tied, the elves stepped back, admiring their work one final time. They turned toward the shadows, But before they disappeared, the smallest elf, the one with silver hair, paused. He glanced toward where Everett and Agnes were hidden, his luminous eyes twinkling with knowing mischief. Then, with a final twirl of his tiny cloak, he vanished into the night. Everett and Agnes sat in stunned silence, their hands clasped together. When at last they emerged from their hiding place, they found the workbench empty, save for the perfectly completed shoes and a single gift left behind. A tiny, golden acorn, shimmering with a quiet, otherworldly glow. A token of thanks. Agnes picked it up, turning it gently in her fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "What does it mean?" Everett smiled, a warmth spreading through him, filling him with something deeper than mere gratitude. "I think," he said softly, "it means we were seen, and we were loved in return." Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it the last echoing whispers of elfin laughter. And in that moment, they knew their lives had been forever changed. Chapter 5. The winter morning dawned with a crispness that carried promise, the first light of the sun casting golden streaks across the village rooftops. The village stirred to life, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the streets, the muffled laughter of children playing in the snow reaching the shop's quiet interior. Inside the shoemaker's shop, Everett and Agnes sat at the workbench, their fingers tracing the delicate ridges of the golden acorn left behind by the elves. It gleamed in the soft morning glow, warm and comforting despite its tiny size. "They will not return," Agnes whispered, a note of wistfulness in her voice, her hands tightening slightly around the edge of the workbench. Everett nodded slowly. He had known it the moment the smallest elf had glanced in his direction with those knowing, twinkling eyes. The gift had been received, the bond had been formed, and the elves had done what they had set out to do. Their work here was finished. And yet, even in their absence, Everett and Agnes felt their presence woven into the very fabric of their shop. It lingered in the warmth of the fire, in the hum of quiet joy that now filled the space. No longer a place of worry and dwindling hope, the workshop now carried a sense of peace, of renewal, of a future filled with possibility. Everett reached for the latest pair of shoes, running his hands along the supple leather. It was perfection, beyond even his finest work. And yet something within him told him that the magic had not just been in the shoes themselves, but in the act of giving, in the kindness exchanged without expectation of return. The elves had given them prosperity, but more than that, they had given them a lesson in gratitude and generosity. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, he found the mayor's wife standing there, wrapped in a fine wool cloak, her gloved hands clasped together. Behind her, two noblemen from the neighbouring town dismounted from their horses, casting admiring glances toward the shop's display. "Master Everett," the mayor's wife said warmly, her eyes twinkling with admiration. "We have heard that your craftsmanship has surpassed even the finest cobblers in the kingdom. We wish to commission your work." Everett glanced over his shoulder at Agnes, who had clasped her hands to her chest, eyes shining with emotion. She nodded, her smile radiant. He turned back with a smile and bowed his head. "It would be my honor." Word of Everett's unmatched craftsmanship spread quickly. Soon travelers from neighboring villages arrived, eager to purchase shoes crafted with a care and quality unlike any other. Nobles sent letters requesting custom designs, and even the royal court murmured interest in the quiet shoemaker whose work was said to be touched by magic. And so the shop flourished once more. Orders came in abundance, and Everett worked each day with renewed passion, never once forgetting the tiny hands that had restored his fortune. He and Agnes never spoke of the elves to anyone, holding their secret close to their hearts, a sacred memory of a time when magic had stepped into their world and changed everything. Yet, as time passed, they found ways to honor the elves in subtle ways. Every year on the first snowfall, Everett and Agnes would leave a small pair of handmade garments on the workbench, folded carefully, waiting beneath the glow of candlelight. Though they never saw the elves return, they always awoke to find the gifts gone, the only trace of their presence a faint, lingering scent of wildflowers in the air. And every so often, when the wind whistled through the trees just right, they swore they could hear the faintest sound of laughter, like bells ringing softly in the distance. And now, dear listener, you have reached the end of our tale. As you rest, let the warmth of kindness, gratitude, and the quiet magic of giving wrap around you like a soft, gentle blanket. Know that the world is full of unseen wonders, of whispers of kindness that ripple far beyond what we can see. Close your eyes and drift into a peaceful slumber, knowing that you are safe, that you are cared for, and that unseen hands weave beauty into your life even as you sleep. May your dreams be filled with light and joy, and may you wake with a heart full of peace. Sleep well, and may the Whispering Elves watch over you through the night.